Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a Sharks player review, something that I haven't done in a few weeks now, as we had to deal with the brunt and the major parts of this very interesting Sharks offseason, discussing the entry draft, free agency, some of the trades and signings made, and just generally a lot of things going on. But now as we get to the quieter part of the offseason, as we have about a month and a half until we get to training camp and preseason, and of course the regular season start, I thought we come back to this series to finish it up and continue to look at how some of these Sharks players did last season. And we are starting off right back where we left off here with a pretty interesting player, that being Brent Burns. Not only is it interesting because Brent Burns has been a major centerpiece for the San Jose Sharks for many years and was still this past year, it's also interesting because of course he was traded to the Carolina Hurricanes just a few weeks ago, so it's also a bit more of a retrospective onto Brent Burns' career with the San Jose Sharks. So let's start off when he was acquired. That was at the 2011 draft in exchange for a first round pick, Charlie Coyle, who at the time was nothing more than just some random prospect, as well as fan favorite Devin Setoguchi. The Sharks brought Brent Burns in and immediately signed him to a 6-year extension worth about $5.6 million per year. And Brent Burns was brought in not necessarily to become the number one guy in every situation for the San Jose Sharks, but to more so fill in Dan Boyle's spot as the number one power play guy, as he would be obviously leaving San Jose over the next coming years. So Brent Burns was going to be sort of trained in that role to hopefully take over that in a couple of years. However, interestingly enough, that very first season, 11-12, the Sharks were not doing all that great. They would still end up making the playoffs, but it would be 7th place in the Western Conference, and they needed a bit more help up front compared to on the back end. And so Brent Burns, who had previously in his career flexed to the forward position, once again did that, and it worked out rather well. Played at times on a line with Joe Thornton and Joe Pavelski, and it really wasn't too bad. So solid that it actually carried in a bit into the following season as well. But as a bit more time passed, it became clear that Brent Burns much rather to be a defenseman than a forward, for a multitude of reasons. I imagine potentially one of them, just based on what we've seen from Brent Burns, is that as a defenseman he gets to play more time on ice. As a forward, you get like 17 or 18 minutes if you're that first line guy, unless you're really elite. But as a defenseman, if you're a first pairing guy, you could easily hit 23-24 minutes a night just like that, even if you're not necessarily so amazing. But with Brent Burns having been a very good defenseman, obviously that time on ice got closer and closer to 30 minutes, which of course is what he loves. Now, Brent Burns, once he did take over for Dan Boyle, there were some small upticks in terms of points. For instance, in the 14-15 season, the year the Sharks missed the playoffs, he did manage to put up 60 points, but that was still in a lower tier than some of the bigger name defensemen at the time, the Erik Karlssons, the Drew Dowdys, the Shea Webbers. And so Brent Burns' name wasn't really talked about, especially since in 14-15 as well, the Sharks missed the playoffs. But it was the 15-16 season that really saw the massive turn in narrative around Brent Burns, as well as just in terms of production. The Sharks went through that refresh of the 14-15 season. They brought in a new coach, Peter DeBoer. They gave Brent Burns a new and very solid defensive partner in Paul Martin. And Brent Burns absolutely flourished in the role. 27 goals as well as 75 points on the year made him a Norris finalist. In the year after that, 16-17, he'd get 29 goals, one away from 30, which is unheard of these days for a defenseman, as well as 76 points, and he would win the Norris that year in his contract year. The Sharks would bring him back on an 8-year, $64 million deal, so $8 million per year, and he would continue to have fantastic offensive seasons, at least for the first couple of years of that contract. The first year was a slight downturn at 67 points, but the year after that, 18-19, the year the Sharks absolutely geared up for a push for the Stanley Cup, he would be his first ever point per game season at 83 points in 82 games, continuing to lead the San Jose Sharks in points. However, past the 18-19 season, like the rest of the San Jose Sharks organization, Brent Burns took a turn for the worse. And you could say that generally the situation with the Sharks not missing the playoffs obviously is going to see Brent Burns' point totals fall, but also another reason you could point to is the departure of Joe Pavelski. You see, Joe Pavelski was widely regarded as one of the best players in the league, if not the best player in the league, when it came to tipping pucks into the net. And of course, Brent Burns is also widely regarded as one of the best, if not the best, defensemen in the league at getting pucks towards the net. He is a high volume shooter. And as you would expect, a player who is very good at tipping pucks and a player who is very good at shooting pucks, they would have pretty good chemistry together. So without Joe Pavelski in front of the net, tipping in and tipping a lot of these Brent Burns shots, his point totals naturally suffered rather significantly because of that. And so generally, Brent Burns saw that downturn where instead of being more than worth the contract, more than worth the $8 million they were paying him over these past couple of seasons, as of late, he wasn't worth all that much, which is why 3 years later, the Sharks as an organization are pretty happy to move on from his $8 million deal, even if they have to end up retaining 33% of that. But let us actually go into the stats from this season, because it really wasn't too bad. 82 games played, 10 goals, 44 assists for 54 points. For a defenseman as old as Brent Burns is, this is actually an extremely solid point total, I would say. But I also want to focus a bit more on the 82 games played. That is a full season, and that has really been Brent Burns' MO as a San Jose Shark. He plays, like I mentioned many times in the past, in every possible situation. Down a goal, up a goal, tie game, shorthanded, 6-on-5, power play, even strength, overtime, every single possible situation he is on the ice. He's against the other team's best players and just generally is facing really tough situations, and yet he manages to not only play a full season this year, but play a full season pretty much every single year. The last time Brent Burns actually missed games in a season was back in the 13-14 season. That means he has played 8 straight full NHL seasons, which is insanely impressive. In my previous video, I talked about how Patrick Marleau did something similar, and while that's also extremely impressive, Patrick Marleau was not necessarily being put in so many dangerous positions, but Brent Burns absolutely was. He's playing a ton of minutes, like I've mentioned. It's just kind of incredible, and with some luck as well as a lot of good conditioning on his body, that he has managed to avoid injury for this long. So very impressive that he manages to play the full 82 games. Now, having said all that, you might think, well, the praise that I have levied towards Brent Burns, is his grade actually going to be all that great? Well, not necessarily, because even though he had all of this time on ice, 26 minutes and 9 seconds, which is good for first on the team, he had the most shorthanded ice time on the team, the second most power play ice time on the team, the most overtime time on ice on the team, and also just generally the third most time on ice in the entire league per game. Even though all of these things are indeed the case, the fact it can be argued that Brent Burns maybe wasn't fully deserving of all of that. You could definitely start to see Brent Burns' age coming through a bit. He didn't have as much of a agility on his first stride forward when in the defensive zone, which caused him where he would always in the past get lost in the defensive zone. It was much more punishing this year when he didn't have that quick first step and he wasn't able to identify the most dangerous player as fast as he has been able to do in the past. So there have been many games over this past season where I've mentioned that Brent Burns should probably see a downtick in terms of ice time because he's just being overloaded a bit too much, especially when the Sharks were dealing with so many of those issues and injuries on the back end, where Brent Burns was constantly and consistently playing 29, even sometimes 30 minutes a night. It wasn't necessarily something that he was super deserving of because he was seeing some issues in the defensive zone, which is why, as you'll see here, his grade actually does suffer somewhat. While I do think it was still a pretty decent year for Brent Burns, it was not anything that absolutely blew me away. And like I mentioned in the past, when it came to that Brent Burns trade, it was definitely the correct time to move on from him, and the Sharks will be happy to get out of that contract at this point, as Brent Burns is given the grade of a C+. Class dismissed.